recording. So if you are don't want your image to show on the recording, you should turn off your. But we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. This is Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. What's in your water? A Chesapeake conversation, which is our celebration of Earth Month. So yay for Earth Month. So just a little tech orientation, even though we've been doing this for 3 years. If you're here, please keep yourself muted for the beginning and the part of this presentation. Towards the end, when we get to questions and answers, we probably will be able to take off mute, but for now, please keep yourself muted unless you're a presenter when it's your turn. If you need help, please use the chat function and you can send a chat to our staff and we will help you if we can. And then also, as I mentioned, this is being recorded. So if you don't want your image to show, please turn your camera off. All right. So for those of you who don't know, I am Bonnie Sorak. I am the Director of Outreach for Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. And on this Zoom presentation tonight, I have some of our other staff members with me. They will wave. We have Molly Rudlow. She's with our Eastern Shore Outreach Coordinator, and Taylor Swanson is here. He does our Anne Arundel and Lower Shore, Southern Maryland. So tonight's program, just to give you a rundown so you know what to expect, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll have an opening prayer. We want to thank our sponsors and our speakers and our funders. And then we'll give you a little overview about, really quickly, about Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake and our One Water Partnership Program. And then we will hear from our speakers. So tonight we will be hearing from Ted Ibn Jabez. Oh, I don't think I got it right that time. From the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper and the Lower Susquehanna Executive Director. Matt Pluta is here from the Choptank Riverkeeper, and Barbara Johnson from Blue Water Baltimore. Susan Parker and Dr. Jennifer Nyland from Wacomico Environmental Trust and the Creek Watchers Program. And then we'll close up the evening with Fred Tutman from the Patuxent Riverkeeper, the organization's founder. So each one of our presenters will be introducing themselves, giving you a little bit of their credentials, so we don't have to go back and forth in between. So they'll be doing that. Then we'll have hopefully about 20 minutes for questions and answers. We do, if you'd like, just put your questions in the chat and let us know if it's for a particular Riverkeeper that you're asking your question. And then we will end with a closing prayer. So to get started, we always want to acknowledge, and please feel free, even though you're muted, to join reading along. So join us in recognition that today we hold space for reflection on and gratitude for the land upon which we live and the local waters that support and nourish us all. We recognize that this land and these waters were stewarded by many who came before. For thousands of years, indigenous people have called the shores of the Chesapeake home. Although we have lost many names, we ask you to honor and learn from their intimate connection, love, and appreciation of these sacred lands and waters. So first, thank you to all of our sponsors and funders. IPC could not do our work without a great lineup of technical partners that help us all throughout the watershed, and we couldn't do this work without them. So many of them are on this call tonight. And then, of course, we are funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and the Chesapeake Bay Trust funds many of our programs, as do our local municipalities as well. So thank you all for your sponsorship. So IPC works as a translator or conduit between faith communities, our technical partners like we just described, and local governments as well. So we all work together in concert to try to bring faith communities into caring for God's creation. We know that faith communities own a lot of land within the watershed and are in a particularly powerful place to help influence the actions on their own congregational grounds and then to influence those, the members that come and learn in the pews. So we look to congregations to model behavior that people then take home and can put those actions into practice at home. So who's doing this already? We have over 120 congregations have signed our partner congregation pledge. If you're here today from a congregation that has not yet signed our pledge, we encourage you to do this. Earth Month is a great month to get started. So go ahead and bring it up at your congregation. And if you haven't planned anything for Earth Month, you can celebrate in that way. And then certainly we can connect with you to get you started on taking some action. So we have over 120 congregations that have signed our partner pledge, and we welcome you as well. We also have our Faithful Green Leaders training. We just finished one up in March. Our next one will be in October. We find that congregations can definitely take stronger and more sustained action if they have a creation care ministry at their congregation. We call them green teams. Congregations come with all different kinds of names for them. But we've trained over 160 congregations, mostly in Maryland, but as far away as New York and down to Virginia. So this training will be offered in October again. It is a virtual training, 3 Thursday nights in a row for about 90 minutes. And we welcome congregations to come and join us. So today we are kicking off our new action kit, The Blessing of a Waterway. This is what we put forth to be kind of our celebration resource for this Earth Day. And this is available on our website, and all throughout the watershed, we'll be having Blessings of the Waterway. I'll be having one this Sunday at a Presbyterian church in Baltimore. And we have them. This resource is available to congregations to use on your own, or we hope to use this for years to come, and congregations can use it whenever they would like. So make use of that. So tonight we have a great lineup of Riverkeepers that are working to help protect and educate people about the water quality in their area. So we have our lineup of Waterkeepers, and so we will be starting up at the top and meandering our way down to the lower parts of the watershed. So, oh, did I skip the prayer, Taylor? Was that the slide with the Reverend Bailey? I skipped over. This is what's supposed to be where you are. So we have Reverend Bailey from Bethel AME Church in Lancaster. He has graciously joined us to offer us a moment of opening prayer. So Reverend Bailey, please unmute.
Let us pray. Just the creator of all creation, stand in awe before you, desiring actions and visions that bring harmony to all humanity, come from all walks of life, different traditions, different cultures. We want to be one as you are one. Give us our many misunderstandings and wisdom. Seek for understanding, share hopes, dreams of proud hopes and humble successes. Now it's time for us to come together and meet, speak with both truth and acceptance, one another's ideas, personal and culture. Please remind us that you have put us in charge of all your environment, all your creation. Help us to work together with one purpose that blesses not only ourselves, but all humanity. Let us see the beauty of your creation. Give us a desire to strengthen, to maintain, enhance, and develop that which you have given us to us. May our courage match our convictions, our integrity match our hopes. May our faith in you bring us closer to each other and that which you have created. May our meeting honor our past and give hope to our present, and leave a legacy that will bless the generations that follow. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. All right. So let me skip ahead here.
I hope you heard me.
We heard you. Yes, loud and clear. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Let me get back to where we were. And I think we were just about to start with Ted. So Ted is the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper. So Ted, feel free to unmute and fill us in what's going on up there.
Sure. And then we have the slideshow queued up too, right?
Yep, all ready to go.
Thank you. And then I'll just cue you guys when to switch. So I'm sure it's, maybe some of you know, most of you know, Waterkeeper Alliance is an international organization of water body based grassroots organizations that advocate for and bring legal action to protect waters all around the world. There's over 320 waterkeepers on 6 continents protecting some 2.6 million square miles of water. And the idea of a working waterkeeper is that there's one person who is the advocate for that water body. It's their full-time job. You know, they patrol their water body, whether it's a creek, a river, a lake, a sound, or a bay. They have a boat and they're not afraid to take polluters to court and use all available legal means to bring them into compliance. Next slide. So the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper Association, or LSRA, we were formed to create a network of support and partners for the work of the Riverkeeper. The Riverkeeper was licensed by Waterkeeper Alliance at the request of citizens, including some within government, that thought we needed a stronger advocate for the Susquehanna River watershed, and an advocate that would hold polluters and the government to task. Our organization is a member of Waterkeeper Alliance, and we're rooted in the movement for swimmable, drinkable, and fishable water. And so the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper Association, we are dedicated to the improvement and preservation of the ecology and aesthetic qualities of the Lower Susquehanna and Juniata watersheds. And improvement comes through many different means. We use education, research, advocacy, and insistence upon compliance with the law. The Riverkeeper works as an alliance builder, a diplomat, an educator, and when the situation calls for it, an unrelenting defender and advocate of our river and the river's right to be healthy and prosperous. The Riverkeeper also, we participate in many different community events around our area. We host events, we provide research and legal action to improve the health of the Susquehanna River waterways. Next slide. So this is a map of our territory. As you can see, it's pretty large. We have from Sealands Grove, where Penns Creek comes into the river, all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay at Haverty Grace. It also includes the Juniata watershed. So in total, we have a little over 8,500 square miles of water where we manage and identify sources of pollution. So it's not just the river, it's every single little creek and tributary that feeds the river. So it's quite a bit that we have up here in the Lower Susquehanna. There's also a Middle Susquehanna Riverkeeper, and further north into New York, we do not have any water keepers right now. It's our mission to change that, hopefully here soon. Next slide. So this is just a good running list of some of the pollution sources that we're seeing and that we respond to. So we have point source, and we have non-point source sources. So I'm sure, as most of the people are aware, agricultural runoff, manure, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, we have it. We have some of the greatest amount of it throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Lancaster and York counties are 2 main counties that are heavily agriculture. So we see a lot of non-point source pollution coming from agriculture, stormwater runoff, and obviously development and land use. We work on a lot of different point sources, such as sewage discharges and wastewater treatment, industrial facilities such as power plants, paper mills, food processors, slaughterhouses, concentrated animal feeding operations, landfills, and many more. Next slide. So the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper Association, we serve all communities in the Lower Susquehanna River and Juniata watersheds, and as well as the Chesapeake Bay, which is around 4.5 million people. We engage with citizens all around the watershed regarding issues such as coal ash contamination, landfills, plastics, microplastics, CAFOs slaughterhouses, public access, agricultural pollution, stormwater runoff, combined sewer overflow, the requirements of the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load, or TMDL, or pollution diet, diseases which affect smallmouth bass and other aquatic species, fish kills, and relicensing of hydroelectric dams such as Conowingo, among other issues. Next slide. So last year we secured a huge victory against the polluting slaughterhouse. From 2012 through 2020, the Keystone Protein Plant in Lebanon County continuously violated their state-issued discharge permit for nitrogen. And excessive nitrogen in our waters cuts the oxygen right out and fuels algal blooms, and is detrimental to aquatic life and humans. And after failed attempts by the state to fix the issue, we filed a lawsuit against the company in 2019, which demanded compliance of the Clean Water Act and penalties assessed for those violations. In 2019, the federal court judge ruled in our favor and held the company liable for 288 days and 73 consecutive months worth of violations. Through negotiations last year, we settled a penalty for $1 million with the polluter Keystone. And 100% of that $1 million went directly to stream restoration projects in Lebanon, Lancaster, and York counties. So our efforts here not only stopped the polluter from harming our environment and breaking the law, but we also required them to pay significant penalties, which went right back into the environment to improve water quality. So these are the kind of successes for our river that we get to celebrate. Next slide. Since 2009, our organization has been heavily involved in the relicensing of Conowingo Dam. And hydroelectric dam relicensing is so super important because they're massive structures that fundamentally alter a river system and its ecology. And they get relicensed every 30 to 50 years, which presents a once in a lifetime opportunity to make sure the dam owner is held responsible for its operations at the dam. In the case for Conowingo, Maryland issued a water quality certification in 2018 that provided all of the protections Maryland felt was necessary to protect water quality. However, though, Constellation Energy, the dam's owner, decided not to accept those conditions and fought Maryland in state and federal court. And it didn't take long for Constellation to essentially strong arm Maryland into submission and coerce them into a terrible settlement agreement, which happened in 2019. That did not incorporate the same kind of conditions and protections that Maryland actually originally called for. So that settlement was incorporated into a 50-year license. And since it lacked so many protections and was indeed unlawful, our organization filed a petition with the federal court in 2021. And last year in December 22, the court ruled in our favor and threw out the license and required the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to accept Maryland's original certification. So that's huge. It set national precedent for the rest of the country for hydroelectric dam relicensing and for the Clean Water Act. So, our legal efforts here are definitely a true David and Goliath situation. The Conowingo Dam is the single largest threat to the success of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan. And our organization made sure that that threat was addressed. So this was only the third time in US history that a court has ever fully vacated a hydropower license. So again, it does set national precedent, and that the Clean Water Act just can't be set aside. And although we secured this major win, we still have so much left to do to make sure the Susquehanna River and Chesapeake Bay are protected from the dam and Constellation is held accountable. Next slide. So since 2020, we've been monitoring the leachate coming out of Monarch Landfill, which is being discharged to Creights Creek in York County. And for many years, the landfill and its owner have been violating their permit and discharging pollutants above their limits. In 2022, we started monitoring for PFAS, which are compounds also known as forever chemicals. In part of a nationwide study conducted by Waterkeepers across the US, Monarch Landfill had the highest concentration of PFAS in the entire country. We filed a citizen suit against Monarch Landfill in January of this year to force compliance of the Clean Water Act, which also addresses the PFAS too that they're discharging. So we're monitoring their progress. They're going to be installing a new treatment system, and we're going to be seeking penalties that the landfill will have to pay for its repeated failures in breaking the law. Next slide. Also, since this is a huge issue for us here in our state capital, Since 2019, our organization has been monitoring bacteria levels in the river around Harrisburg. Every time it rains, Pennsylvania's state capitol releases millions of gallons of raw sewage mixed with stormwater into the river. And these releases of raw sewage happen on average about once a week or more whenever there is any kind of rain or clogging that overwhelms Harrisburg's antiquated and failing combined sewage and stormwater system. In 2015, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and the EPA sued the city and Capital Region Water, the Water Authority, for these ongoing violations. And since the state's signing of a partial consent decree in 2015, the problem's only gotten worse. Not one plan has been presented to address these issues, and some time has gone by. So our organization filed a motion to intervene in that lawsuit, and the judge ruled in our favor, and we now have a seat at the table, so we can make sure that all of the agencies and the Water Authority do what they need to do to address these violations and restore water quality for the Susquehanna River. So more to come there. And next slide. And just for timing's sake, am I okay on time for now? Just a couple more minutes? Thanks. So we do have a couple, I'm just going to wrap up with a couple programs that we're running right now. So last year we started hosting a microplastics monitoring program. We have a dedicated team in York County right now to start, where they're monitoring for microplastics all around in 10 or 11 different tributaries that feed into the Susquehanna. And what we're seeing is pretty much every single one of those sites that we have on 10 different creeks, we're seeing plastics present in all of those creeks, which is very alarming. Plastics do a lot to the human body, to aquatic species, and it's a threat that we are addressing and monitoring continuously. Next slide. So in 2022, we received some grant funding to initiate our Water Watchdogs program. Similar to other Waterkeeper programs, there are other Waterkeepers that I believe on this call who have similar programs to test and monitor for bacteria. So we're going to be starting that here around the lower Susquehanna and looking at popular public access points where people are going to enter the river to fish, to swim, to kayak, to boat. And we're going to be out there every week through the recreational season from May through September to get samples taken right before the weekend starts. That way we can share data before the weekend and people know exactly how their water is and if they should recreate or not. So that's a really cool program we're going to be starting here in the next month. Next slide. So that's it for me. 10 minutes is not much, but I would ask all the folks on the line, if you want to learn more about what we're doing around the lower Susquehanna, please check out our website, check out our Facebook page, Instagram, all social media, and follow what we're doing. There's so many issues that we're dealing with in the lower Susquehanna that just needs such dire attention, and we want to make sure that we elevate these issues to lawmakers, to our state agencies and others. We are as strong as the support that we receive. I'm one man, but we approach these issues as an army. So if folks are interested in joining us, please become a member. Please sign up for any of our volunteer events. If you're interested in any of our programs, please reach out and come aboard. We welcome everyone, and we hope that you might find some interest with the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper Association. And with that, I thank you for listening. And again, any questions, please let me know.
Thanks so much, Ted. All right. That was a lot of information. I'm sure people have some questions for you at the end. So next up, we have Matt Pluta from the Choptank Riverkeeper.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Yep.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Ted, just want to say thank you for that great presentation and all the good work you're doing. I look at you, Fred Tutman, Barbara here representing the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, and you guys are the ones that keep us motivated in this fight and all the good work you're doing. So it's great to be here. Great to be here with all the speakers representing good environmental protection work going on around the Bay. So I'm from the Eastern Shore. I don't know how many folks on the call are from the shore, but I'm sure at some point you've driven through. Molly's here. Pastor Paul, I see you here. If anyone else is from the Eastern Shore, maybe go ahead and drop your name and where you're from, and we'll see how many people we have. And if you're not from the Eastern Shore, maybe drop in the chat one of your favorite places that when you do come to the shore where you like to visit, whether it be a wildlife area or some other place. But I work as the Choptank Riverkeeper for ShoreRivers. We're an organization dedicated to protecting and restoring the waterways on Maryland's Eastern Shore using science-based advocacy, outreach, and restoration. And as the Riverkeepers, we take on the effort of our policy and advocacy work in the organization. I'll go ahead and next slide, please. Oh. Next slide for this one. Great. So on the left hand, you'll see the region that we cover. I'm in the Choptank on the lower part of the map there in the blue. And then we have Riverkeepers in the 3 other regions that you see as well. And so together we have 4 advocates that are working together on very similar issues that are threatening all the waterways on the Eastern Shore. We'll talk about those in a second. Next slide. So to give everyone a sort of just a lay of the land, I like to open up and just share with you, some of the demographics and the land use that sort of occupies and makes up the Eastern Shore. And I emphasize this as, our water quality is a representation of how we treat our land. And so it's important to understand where we have issues on land so we know how to address those before it gets into our waterways. And so, we want to make sure that we're focusing and including everybody in the movement to improve water quality. First, you can see here on the map where we have our, equity and diversity and ethnic backgrounds here, and where some of our populations are of different folks. And then on the next slide here, we get into the income base, and you'll see it. We represent a rural area. And so, a lot of our land is dominated by agriculture. And then we have small pockets of urban areas where our lower income families are living, our underserved communities are living. And oftentimes they're cut loose from a lot of the services that you might find common in more rural or more urban areas. The next slide there will show you a little bit of our land use. And so this is a colorful map where essentially what you're seeing is orange and green, and that dominates our forest land and predominantly our agricultural land. And so on the Eastern Shore, there's no surprise that we have a lot of farm fields. It just takes a drive down Route 50 to see that. And most of that agricultural land is used to support the poultry industry in one way or another. And when we look at the statistics, the grain production is about 49-50% of the land. And then if you add in livestock and CAFOs, poultry production, you get to about 60% of the land being agricultural land. And whenever you have a land use that's that dominant, that tends to be your biggest source of pollution. I always say in the urban areas, it's stormwater runoff in urban areas, bacteria pollution coming from those cities. Those are big sources of pollution. In rural areas, it's mostly agriculture, where we have a lot of fertilizer being used to grow crops. And so we describe the Eastern Shore as sort of row crop agriculture. I think one of the things that is missing here is not a lot of small scale farmers. The makeup of the farming on the Eastern Shore tends to be larger land management contracts where farmers are occupying large plots of land and they're trying to grow as much as they can. And so that row crop agriculture, and a lot of it is, again, corn and soy and wheat, those commodities that are being grown to feed the poultry industry. Second biggest land use there is forest land. And as we know, in most of our states, the forest land is decreasing, and we're having the competition between development and forest land. And so we're seeing development increase on the Eastern Shore, particularly as a follow-up from the COVID-19 pandemic. I often say that we've been discovered. What was sort of a quieter part of the state has now become more popular more often, and more people are moving over here, which is, if not done right, could threaten a lot of our natural resources that we rely on for natural processing of pollutants in the waterway. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about agriculture. The other uniqueness that I want to just emphasize is our fisheries and aquatic habitat. And so we spend time working on sort of both of these fronts, and we'll jump to the next slide where I'll get into some of these examples. So I mentioned about the industrial row crop farming. The challenge that we have on the Eastern Shore with what's in our water, the biggest impact or the biggest source of threat is nutrients, and those nutrients are primarily coming from what's being applied to farm fields. And it gets a little trickier than just thinking about it as a non-point source pollution, which runs off when it rains. We've actually learned that about 70% of the nitrogen that's in our rivers comes from groundwater. And so that's not uncommon in an agricultural setting, but what that means is that we're seeing pollution appearing in our waterways from practices that happened sometimes decades ago. And so groundwater can take anywhere from 10 sometimes to 30 or even 40 years, depending on how deep the aquifer is, to sort of transfer what we're putting on the land into the groundwater and then into our local waterways. And so at such a high rate, 70%, I have to optimistically remind our staff and our coworkers that what we're doing now is for the future, as we all know in this work of environmental protection. But truly, it's hard to see instantaneous results on a agricultural setting with non-point source pollution. You got to change systems. You have to change the way nutrients are being applied. You really have to change the way we're thinking about how we're growing food and impacting our resources as we do it. The second there is the poultry operations. And when I talk about sort of the externalities there, it's really, how do we use the manure? I think oftentimes the poultry industry is front and center to what the issues are on the Eastern Shore, but I think more specifically, it's how we manage the nutrients that come from that. And primarily it's a nutrient management issue across the board. Whether a farmer is using poultry manure is one thing because there's so much of it, and sometimes in certain cases, but if they're using synthetic fertilizer in a poor manner or in a way that runs off or seeps into the ground, that can be just as bad. And so the use of fertilizers is sort of the biggest threat that we're dealing with for sure. But again, it's all sort of focused around the farming and the production of poultry. And then lastly, an issue that we're getting more involved with and we're learning more about is, again, it gets back down to nutrient management, but it's the idea of using sludge material as a nutrient source on farm fields. And, Ted brought up a great example about PFAS contamination coming from the landfills. On the Eastern Shore, when we look at potential pathways for PFAS, the forever chemical to enter the waterways, we're really looking at wastewater treatment plants, but also the use of biosolids, the sludge, the solid material that's produced at the wastewater treatment plants. And what we found out is that the Eastern Shore is a large depository of this material for land application on farm fields. And so we're ramping up our testing and understanding of the extent to which biosolids are being applied and how the soils and the downstream waterways are responding to that, specifically with the PFAS chemical. Next slide. So when we think about water quality on the Eastern Shore and we think about it relative to the entire bay, I like to pull up this slide here. So that star on the map is marking the town of Greensboro, Maryland. It's at the headwaters of the Choptank, which is about 68 miles long, 1,000 square mile watershed, and it's predominantly agriculture. And in Greensboro, the USGS has a monitoring station where they've been monitoring flow and water levels, and as of late recently, nutrients as well. And so the Bay program uses this monitoring station along with about 9 others throughout the Chesapeake Bay as their sort of long-term data set to really understand how the efforts that we're putting on the ground, how are they showing up in the waterways? Are we seeing improvements from a lot of the farming, cost share programs or helping put in wetlands and buffers? What's that showing up in the waterway? And sort of the disheartening thing is that the Choptank of all the 9 stations is the only one that's still showing long-term and short-term trends of increasing nutrient or nitrogen and phosphorus loads. And so where the other ones are starting to see an improvement, the Choptank is still seeing more nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus entering into the system. And that is really a picture of how we need to be focusing on the agricultural nutrient runoff issue at large. And so if this is the indicator that, you know, of whether or not we're doing a good job, this is the, you know, the clear sign that we need to be doing more in the agricultural sector. And so that's where we try to position ourselves as ShoreRivers, is to enforce the nutrient management laws to the degree that we can, and then also find ways to change the agricultural system so we're not dealing with such a large scale row crop industry, and we're focusing more on small plots of land that can be managed in a way to improve water quality. Next slide, please. Also significant to the Eastern Shore, I'll point out, is in the water. When we get down to the lower Choptank River, we have a large network of oyster sanctuaries. These are areas where the state has invested upwards of $40 to $50 million to help restore the oyster population, and doing so in an area where the commercial harvest, where the watermen are largely focused, which is on the Eastern Shore, is a challenge, but also opportunities. And so we have our hands in oyster restoration to the degree that improving habitat in our waterways will help to bring back the fish and the species that we all care so much about, that we want to see in our waterways. And oysters, you know, they're the most important species in the entire Chesapeake Bay, you know, in terms of helping to build habitat and also clean water. So we're focused on making sure that those sanctuaries are working and showing and working to see successful results there. Next slide, please. And the last piece here is submerged aquatic vegetation. And so I didn't actually realize this until looking at the map, but the Eastern Shore carries a lot of the weight when it comes to where submerged aquatic vegetation is growing throughout the bay. And so that's another important habitat that we feel if we can have a hand in protecting and even restoring, then we can hope and continue to work towards more of those species that we are working to protect come back into the rivers and into the bay when the water quality conditions are right. And so at ShoreRivers, we have a submerged aquatic vegetation program where we go out and we monitor where these beds are growing via kayak and paddling. And then we send volunteers out there and we harvest seeds from these beds so that we can turn around and plant them in new areas and help to restore the SAV population in areas where they haven't been growing. And so from a fishing perspective, that's great. From a water quality perspective, it's equally as good. And from a, you know, protecting our shoreline against issues like storm surge, sea level rise, flooding, you know, these ecosystems, these habitats are really important. Next slide. Oh, and there we are. So I'll end with that. Appreciate the time to share a little bit about the Eastern Shore and the work that we're doing at ShoreRivers. And if you have any questions, definitely drop them in the chat and we'll get back to them at the end.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. All right, so from the shore, we are going to head over to the Patapsco Riverkeeper, Barbara Johnson from Blue Water, Baltimore.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks to Matt and Ted for their presentations. Really interesting information. I always love hearing what other waterkeepers are doing. I'm here to represent the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, who's Alice Volpitta. So I'm the water quality scientist and I manage our water quality monitoring program at Blue Water Baltimore. So next slide, please. So for those who aren't familiar with Blue Water Baltimore, actually you can even go to the next slide, Bon. We started in 2010 and we were 5 different watershed organizations that came together as one. And one of those organizations was the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper. So really it was just that everyone pretty much had the same mission, which was to restore the water quality of Baltimore's waterways. And it was just easier, I think, to get stuff done under one roof. So next slide, please. We have quite a few different programs at Blue Water Baltimore, and I'll mainly talk about the Waterkeeper program, but I want to mention that we also do a lot of restoration. So we do tree plantings, help make native species gardens, rain gardens, that kind of thing. We planted close to 1,000 trees last year and gave away another 1,000 trees through our restoration team. And we also have a native plant nursery where we, if you were looking to build a rain garden or at your church or at your home business, you can go to our nursery, which is called Herring Run Nursery. And we have an amazing staff there that could help you pick out all the trees, shrubs, plants that you could need. So to talk about more the work that I do under the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, we do use science, policy, and law to protect the waterways. So with the science, we do a lot of water quality monitoring and pollution investigations, and I'll go into that in a minute. We do policy work, so we have someone on staff that does legislative and regulatory work, and then we use the Clean Water Act to hold polluters accountable. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of our watershed, we are the entire Patapsco River watershed and the Back River watershed. So we work within all of the main stems of those rivers and all their tributaries. Next slide, please. So just to talk about our water quality monitoring program a little bit, we have 49 stations that are tidal and non-tidal. So we began collecting bacteria as early as 2009, and then we expanded our program in 2013. So we have 27 stations that are non-tidal, and those are stations that we monitor monthly. Come rain or shine, we're out there. The only thing that keeps us is if we can't access a station. And those are in the Jones Falls and the Gwens Falls, which are in the Patapsco River. And then we have 22 stations that are tidal. And so we put our boat in the water, we just did last week, and we hit those stations bi-weekly. So we do about 10 to 11 one week and then hit the rest the following week. And that we do that April through November. And the data that we collect in our tidal program is classified Tier 3, so it is approved by the EPA and can be used for regulatory purposes. We also have a couple other programs that are in the water quality monitoring program or under us we do macroinvertebrate bug hunting. And we also have started doing community science where we go into, primarily we have been in the Herring Run and the Back River, where we ask community members to come and take a sample. We train them, they take a sample where they're recreating on the water, we process it and produce a map of where everyone's sampled. It all takes place in one day, and then we release that to the public. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of what we're sampling for, we have just basic health indicators, so conductivity, oxygen, water clarity, pH temperature. We do all that with instrumentation, and then we also take grab samples. So we do nutrients for nitrogen and phosphorus, bacteria. We do that in both our tidal and non-tidal, and then we do chlorophyll in our tidal stations. So next slide, please. If you're interested in looking at our data, we house it all at baltimorewaterwatch.org. We have an interactive map that you can hover over the stations and you can see when we were last there, what we sampled for, and if that station passed. There's also a page that describes the parameters and why they're important for water quality. It's definitely a little science nerdy, but not too much. Most people can get into it. Next slide, please. So how our data is used, it really is, we say it's the scientific backbone of all of our work. Within the Waterkeeper program, we basically use it for our advocacy work, our education and outreach, and our enforcement. We partner a lot with academic institutions. We have teachers and students that want to use our data and other partner organizations, and then also for the regulatory work. So for our local Department of Public Works, MDE, and EPA. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my favorite part of the job is our enforcement and pollution reporting. So our enforcement work, it's a little hot right now. We have some cases that have been in the media that we're getting a lot of questions about. We did file a suit against Baltimore City for our wastewater treatment plants. And how I'm going to connect that to our data is that our routine monitoring picked up that we had some high levels of bacteria at the Patapsco wastewater treatment plant. So one of our stations is directly over the effluent pipe that comes from the wastewater treatment plant. We detected the high numbers. We contacted the Maryland Department of Environment, and that prompted for them to inspect both of the wastewater treatment plants, and they failed pretty miserably. So we filed suit, but what's happening now, it's been 2 years in the works, and the back river is actually coming more into compliance than it has in the past. So it's meeting its effluent numbers. So it's polluting as much as it's allowed in simple terms. And then the Patapsco, we don't really have an update. We don't know yet. So if anyone's wondering about that plant, I'm not sure. I don't want to say it's in compliance or not because I don't know. But both still have significant non-compliance in the operation and maintenance departments. So that could be that they're short-staffed and leading to problems of not having the wastewater treatment plant tanks cleaned out properly, that kind of thing. So we're really monitoring that work and keeping in close touch with the city and MDE just to make sure that that suit keeps following through and hopefully gets settled quickly. The other big suit that is taking up a lot of time right now is we just filed a federal suit against Fleischmann's Vinegar. So that picture, that's our waterkeeper, Alice Volpita. She's holding an American eel that died in a fish kill. And so I'd like to talk about this case because it really connects to our pollution reporting. So we have a pollution reporting hotline, and someone called it on a Sunday and just reported a fish kill. In the meantime, I hadn't gotten it yet because it was Sunday, but he remembered that in my email signature was my cell phone. So he called me and said, hey, I just want you to know there's a lot of dead fish out in the Jones Falls. And because of that one call, now we have this big suit against this company that was discharging acid into the Jones Falls. So it's really important, I think, to recognize our pollution reporting and how we connect with communities. And I joke about it, but it's not a joke. We turn them into clean water advocates because they realize that they can follow through with their pollution reports and get something done and have something cleaned up. Next slide, please. So just to talk about a lot of the issues that we deal with here in Baltimore City, we really have 4 main pollutants. So it's sewage, toxins, whether that's an immediate discharge now or legacy toxins. We deal with trash and then runoff. And stormwater runoff is the biggest issue that we have, and it's still growing. It's still the biggest threat we have to our waterways. So a lot of our pollution reporting deals with the things here that are on the slide. So the trash being the illegal dumping. We see a lot of construction sites that aren't in compliance that might, when it rains, the sediment goes into the storm drain system, so it ends up in the stream. Same with wash water. There could be an illegal connection in the system where maybe it's a car wash or a laundromat and they're connected into the stormwater system, so it's discharging into a stream. And then sewage. Baltimore City's infrastructure is really old and it's crumbling. There have been some great projects of capital projects that have improved areas, but we're still seeing thousands and thousands of gallons of sewage running off into our waterways. And then one that's a little newer for us, and we're still kind of dipping our toes into, is drinking water. So we had an incident here in Baltimore where there was E. coli getting into the drinking water. And blue water hasn't always been at the top of our list. We've always been mainly in the streams and the waterways, but this is clearly a public health risk that we need to address, and we're working on ways that we can work that into our programming. So next slide, please. So that's it. I gave the quick and dirty. There's so much information. I was trying to figure out how to dial it down. I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Barbara. And we should have said at the outset, each one of these folks could have been an hour-long presentation. So we really appreciate you condensing what you have to give us this tour around the Bay. All right, so next up is Susan Parker and Dr. Jennifer Nyland from Comical Environmental Trust and the Creek Watches program. I guess they're both going to go back and forth. I'm not sure. Or Susan, you're going to start off?
I am going to start off and I'll hand off to Jen.
Great, thanks.
Hi, thanks so much for this opportunity. I feel like we're a very small but mighty organization after listening to the big guys talking about all that you have. So Wicomico Environmental Trust is a science-based environmental nonprofit that focuses on the Wicomico River watershed. We advocate for environmental justice when such activity is warranted. And of course, we engage in education and outreach efforts within our communities, mostly in Wicomico County. WET was founded in 1989 by a group of residents who were concerned about the direction or the lack thereof of the county's environmental policies. WET's largest and oldest program is Wicomico County Creek Watchers, which is about to release its 20th annual river health report. The entire collection of these reports are available on our website as PDFs that can be opened and read or downloaded at no cost to any interested party. Our Creek Watchers program was organized and established in 2002 under the direction of Dr. Judith Stribling, who was at the time a professor at Salisbury University's biology department. In 2003, its first river health report was released. WET took over the lead position of volunteer coordination, outreach, and funding of Creek Watchers, which was at that time in its 16th year. Creek Watchers currently monitors 26 sites spread out across the entire watershed that include non-tidal ponds, mostly mill ponds, creeks and streams, and of course, the length of the river's main stem. This bi-weekly sampling takes place from mid-March through the first half of November. Next slide, please. Actually, next slide after that. The Wicomico River watershed begins a few miles south of the Delaware state line on the Delmarva Peninsula and travels roughly 24 miles southwest to Tangier Sound, from which its waters enter the Chesapeake Bay. The map that you see on the screen shows the watershed within the context of the entire state of Maryland, just to give you an idea where we're located. The inset provides a closer look at the watershed itself. The river, along with railroads, have defined over time the locations that have become the modern seat of government today, which is Salisbury, as well as a number of smaller towns and communities throughout the county. Next slide, please. The tidal marshes of the estuary that's known as the Wicomico River have always been and continue to be vital to the Chesapeake Bay's ecosystem, providing habitat for birds, wildlife, and marine life while filtering out pollutants. In the 17th century, it was called the Rockawakan River by the indigenous people whose villages and communities were largely located along the banks of the river. These people included the Nanticokes, which was the most numerous tribe living on the portion of Delmarva we know as Lower Eastern Shore. Next slide, please. Fast forward to the 18th century, and the picture you see here is the remnants of what used to be the largest commercial dock during this 18th century on the river. The town of Salisbury, located near the north end of the river, was incorporated in 1732. On maps of the Lower Peninsula, Salisbury is barely mentioned at all, if it shows up at all. Salisbury owes its existence because of the Wicomico River, which runs through the heart of its downtown area northward to Sussex County, Delaware, barely, and southward to Mount Vernon in Somerset County, Maryland, where it empties into the Tangier Sound, very close to the only other river that flows in part of Wicomico County, which is the Nanticoke River. The Wicomico River was the primary mode of transportation in an era that preceded paved roads, railroads, and motor vehicles. It was the lifeblood of the region, with tall sailing ships traveling most of the length of the river. From Tangier Sound to a wide curve in the river near present-day Whitehaven in western Wicomico County. These tall sailing boats carried the requirements of daily life to the residents and businesses, filling up for the return trip with goods to be sold in markets far away from the rural peninsula. On that curve, there was once a massive commercial wharf, which you see the remnants of here, that received those goods and sent produce destined for markets elsewhere. This spot is known as Pirates Wharf because how could it not be called that? Smuggling, piracy, and other clandestine activities are said to all have taken place at that wharf. There is a county park now in development at the site. Next slide, please. It wasn't until 1867, when Salisbury became the county seat of a fledgling county, that railroads and highways were developed and transportation supremacy moved from water to dry land. Today, we see that Salisbury, which was called in the 1960s and 1970s the crossroads of Delmarva, is now central to life on the lower shore in many ways. It is the most densely populated municipality in the region. Wicomico has the largest county of the 3 lower counties. As you can see in this slide, which depicts the river in downtown Salisbury, the riverfront is bulkheaded with a paved walkway called the Salisbury River Walk on both sides. It is a site used for festivals, with small attractions along the way that include an amphitheater near Route 13, one of our major highways. And it's used for smaller concerts and events throughout most of the year. Next slide, please. Now I have a few facts about the river and its watershed. The watershed contains 481 linear stream miles, which is not very impressive compared to the larger watersheds that preceded our presentation, but it's what we have. There's 230 square miles of landmass. 69% of it is in Wicomico County, 30% is in Somerset County, and 1% in Sussex County, Delaware. The watershed is 44% agricultural land, 38% forested, and 16% developed paved urban area. It is 25% wetlands, if you don't count the massive network of drainage ditches, which are used by agriculture. While agriculture remains a major driver of Wicomico County's economy, a robust tourism industry is also a critical piece. This tourism is largely based on the condition of our outdoors environment and water quality, and includes bird watching, fishing, crabbing, boating, hunting, nature photography, youth and adult sports and sporting events, kayaking, and more, which makes the work of our Creek Watchers program more important in terms of dollars and cents, as both agriculture and tourism rely on a clean environment. I'm happy to report that over the course of the past 2 decades, significant progress has been recorded based on the scientific analysis of the data and samples that are provided by our work and the work of 50 or so Creek Watcher volunteers. This improvement happens in small increments, but indicates overall progress in the right direction. The next section on water quality will be presented by Dr. Jennifer Nyland, faculty member of the Department of Biological Science at Salisbury University's Henson School of Science and Technology, and lab director coordinator for the Wicomico River Creek Watchers since 2021.
Thanks, Susan. So just a snapshot for you of what's going on in the lab. In my lab, actually, on a bi-weekly basis during our sampling season, which mirrors most of what you've heard already. So we start sampling in mid-March and run through the early part of November. And we sample for almost all of those same outcomes that Barbara was talking about. And just like Matt and others have mentioned, and Susan, we have a lot of agricultural land use that causes some changes in the river, but I think our picture is maybe a little bit more positive than for our little tiny watershed than what you've heard already. So next slide, please. So the one sort of interesting piece that's come out of our recent data, here you can see salinity levels. We break up our watershed to make reporting a little bit easier into different portions of the river. So we have ponds and fresh water portions of upstream of the river. And then we have sort of slightly salty, what we call oligohaline, and then more salty mesohaline further down towards the mouth of the river. And so we found that sort of lumping the data together in these areas has helped us to track trends. We do still have site-by-site data available in our technical report, but these are the kinds of data that we make available to the public and that you'll see in those reports that Susan was mentioning, being able to find on our website. So what you see on these types of graphs, and I'm only showing you 3. The gray bars are long-term averages. So over the last 20 years that we've been collecting data, where are we and where have we been, right? And so there, every year those change slightly, but the orange bars are what happened over the last sampling season. And so what we're doing is we're just looking for trends for how things have changed over time. And we're hoping to see things that are moving us in the positive direction, or things that are concerning where we're stopping to move in the right direction and where we might need to advocate for some more of those changes. So salinity is one of the things that we've been tracking. And we are, of course, worried about this because of potential sea level rise and saltwater incursion. And in fact, this trend of increasing salinity and it is potentially indicative of that, but not yet to the point where we're significantly worried. Salisbury does, however, have a flooding problem. We are certainly, it's something that we are considering as part of any of the county and regional long-range planning, is to try to figure out what we can do, how we can advocate to help to protect our communities and our land in this area. Next slide, please. So chlorophyll level, directly related to nutrient runoff usually, is increasingly moving in the right direction. So what we're showing here are the 2 different lines that you'd like to look at. So the level up with the dashed line at 40 micrograms per liter is like, it's called technically the eutrophication level, right? So this is like pretty impaired. We do not want to be in that range, and we're really excited that we're moving closer down towards that solid line. Unfortunately, the solid line represents an impaired level, so chlorophyll is elevated. What this means is that we do have more algal blooms that are happening in the river than we would like to see. So it's not super clear, but we're moving in the right direction. And we can point to this as hopefully evidence that we are doing the right things, and we can continue to push folks to continue to do some of the difficult things to move the watershed in the right direction. Next slide. And then nutrients. So I just had to show nitrates. Again, the dashed line is impaired, and you can see that historically we have been over the impaired level, but recent trends have demonstrated that we are moving in the right direction. And in particular, that are the more saline areas of the river are moving further and further in the right direction. This trend is not always followed with phosphate. As most of you might know, it is more of a legacy compound. So you could see some more of the phosphate versions that are coming up out of the sediments, but on the whole, we feel like we're making really good progress. One piece of data that I didn't include, I'm just going to really quickly mention because of the bacteria talk that's already happened, is that we have been monitoring at a subsample of our sites during the sort of May to September timeframe. We've been looking at bacteria levels in this subsample of watersheds, but of the watershed. But the mayor of Salisbury last year asked us to think about looking at bacterial source tracking to try to find out in some additional samples, including those ones that we've been sampling, where the levels of those bacteria were coming from. So looking at, is it coming from pets? Is it coming from people? Or is it coming from birds? So we thought that those 3 would be able to give us a better picture. And thanks in part to that information, we're still doing the analyses, but we have decided and received funding to support bacterial measurements across all of our samples for the entire season. So going forward, we should have a much clearer picture of inputs to the watershed that might be coming from most likely those concentrated animal feeding operations and agricultural activities. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, both Susan and Dr. Nyland. And last but not least, we have Fred Chapman from the Choptank Riverkeeper.
Wow. You sure you don't want to take a break? That's a lot. At one sitting, I feel like the squirm factor is setting in. But be that as it may. So I'm going to approach this a little differently. I'd say we're kind of outliers. But I will also say that I've been the riverkeeper on this river for 20 years. And I've seen a lot. When I started, there were 7 riverkeepers in the Chesapeake. Now I think there's something like 17 or 18 or something like that. We roll from, next slide, please. So we roll from a very different point of view about most of this. And for that reason, I think we're a bit standoffish as a program. We're not a science-based organization. We're a community-based one, which doesn't mean we ignore the science by any stretch. But the science is not a compelling message, to be honest, if we want to rally people to get them riled up and constructively angry about the state of the rivers, about the state our river is in. It is a river that stays entirely within the state of Maryland. It is a river with a particularly stellar history of activism. Actually, the only river in the state of Maryland ever to be substantially cleaned up in the 1980s, only to see those gains lost again. It was the river that gave rise to the Chesapeake Bay movement, actually, which is why it has the only state river commission. And I would say that our investment in community-based work is largely driven by our reluctance to rely on programs that can be defunded. We believe that citizens have to own this work in order to fight to protect these rivers. And if it's owned by the funders, those are movements that I think are rather provisional in terms of their ability to get the mass that they need and the kind of support they need from the general public. But that said, the next slide, please. We are a river with just about every other problem you'll find on lots of these rivers, right? For a long time, I think we had the largest coal burning power plant. It's been a couple of years since our activism and legal work actually shut down the coal boilers, but there are legacy problems connected with the coal waste that still remains and some of the footprints that this particular facility has left on our watershed. Next slide, please. We work very, very closely with a number of frontline communities in our watershed, particularly Eagle Harbor. I think it's the smallest municipality in the state of Maryland, population about 70 folks. All kinds of issues and concerns that small municipalities have in their capacity to compete for grant funds and other things they need to meet environmental mandates when they're competing with big towns and places with lots of political support. Next slide, please. We have a considerable outreach, I think, to communities of color and are largely staffed by Indigenous people. That's who answers the phone at our office. That's who does most of the work. I would say, unlike some conservation organizations in the region, we don't have a diversity inclusion problem. We're actually a go-to destination for people of color. And we take that to heart. We're actually deeply influenced by the input that we get from these communities. And I think we have higher expectations than some. In other words, this is not a lost leader. These are, I think, deeper, more durable movements, not only because the work is owned by the communities themselves, but I'd say the fighting spirit to fight programs and initiatives and systems that these are not people who are invested in those systems, and thus we have no need to defer to them. We'll clean up the bay or the river in our own way, but we sure as heck are not going to do it on the basis of what wealthy people tell us to do and boss us around. But I will say we have a pretty good record as bounty hunters. We have pulled $860 million from polluters in 20 years, 1.3 million in just the past week, actually. And like our colleague Ted mentioned earlier, all that money goes into the watershed. But I guarantee you, you're not going to find many foundation grants in that stratosphere. There's more money to be found out here making the polluters pay for what they've taken than there is any day of the week if you're writing these proposals and sending off these screeds to these funders who have, frankly, a pretty narrow vision. And sadly, a pretty terrible plan for cleaning up the bay, as far as I can see. It's not much of a plan at all. Actually, the one that most people seem to be following, it doesn't have any deadline. None of it's compulsory. And quite frankly, it doesn't capture hearts and minds. It's not consistent with the history of what it has taken in the past in order to clean up these rivers. Government promises generally didn't clean much up at all. Next slide, please. We have done numerous health impact studies in partnership with a number of different universities and colleges. Usually that's the front line for our involvement with local communities. We sit down and talk with these communities about the problems that they perceive and they want to solve. And we do so with, yes, science, right? But you see, we got to the science through a different vector. We got through the science, I think, through a humanitarian and a compassionate vector that looks at environmental health problems, not just redeeming recreational opportunities. We do some of that too, actually. We're one of the arbiters of the Patuxent Water Trail. We run a website devoted to that. But we never lose sight of the idea that many of the end users for these watersheds lack sufficient power to fight these battles without our assistance. And the idea is that we help these communities strategically stand up and fight their own battle so we can move on to the next one, essentially paying it forward, building a community on, granted, a much smaller watershed than some of the ones you've seen here tonight. One with 110 miles long and 36 wastewater treatment plants on it. If you can do the math, that's a pretty daunting statistic in terms of how much duty is in that river on any given day. Next slide, please. We're doing a lot of work right now in Lothian. We have a pretty good legal team that's been working for 2 years to build power for this little suburb in Anne Arundel County on the border of 2 watersheds that has way too many burdens, including 4 consistently leaking for the last 2.5 years wastewater treatment plants, literally leaking raw solids into the river. We've been fighting with the EPA and with the Maryland Department of the Environment to get them to actually pay attention to the problem. That is an indicator, I think, of the lack of power of this community. I cannot imagine if you went to Potomac, Maryland and had 4 leaking wastewater treatment plants, that problem would persist for 2.5 years. The simple problem is it's not a priority, apparently, for any of the regulators. And it's a serious problem indeed. Next slide, please. This is actually some of the art that we got with one of our lawyers wearing wetsuits swimming up the creek that one of those wastewater treatment plants discharges into, just to kind of give you kind of a visual reference for what's coming out of that pipe. Not a very savory scene. Next slide, please. So this is a drone shot of one of the worst facilities that we found in Lothian. It's called Westport Reclamation. It's a sand and gravel mine that got its special exception in 1967, but was grandfathered under 1957 law at a time when Maryland didn't have a stormwater program, didn't have much of anything in terms of environmental laws. Even though it's supposed to be a sand and gravel mine, they ran out of sand and gravel 12 years ago. They claim they're reclaiming the site. Next slide, please. This is how they reclaim the site. They dump stuff that we don't even know what it is in there. And the 1967 special exception does not give the county the right to inspect the site. So the county can't even walk on there and find out what's in these trucks. I photographed 155 trucks 2 weeks ago going into this particular facility. Several of them said sewage only. Guys in Tyvek suits. In this picture, you can barely see the guys in Tyvek suits discharging a black treacly substance that we don't know what it is into a pit. This is a sand and gravel mine, mind you. You can see why we want this site re-regulated. You know, these guys are mad at us because we've been challenging their zoning, causing all kinds of problems. Their employees run out the entrance and scream at us, you're trying to take our jobs. I don't think we have the moral authority to take bread off of anybody's table. I think what we want is to have these guys apply for a legitimate special exception for what they actually do. That's the problem. They're running a game, obviously, and it's not one. It's on the banks of the Patuxent River, and it's not a game that leads to anything good for the watershed. It's an unaccountable facility that cannot be regulated by virtue of its original special exception. It's shocking when you really get into it. And mind you, while I saw 155 trucks going into it, county records show that there are 3,500 trucks a day rolling past this facility in a residential community. You can see why residents are good and pissed off about too many trucks. They don't know what's in the trucks. They don't know what's going on in these facilities. Next door to it is the state's first licensed marijuana growing facility called Forward Grow. That's been busted 3 times by the EPA for putting bad chemistry, illegal chemistry, on their weed. The fines require them, and the remediation measures require them to burn their suspect product, which sends clouds of weird smelling smoke and other stuff across the neighborhood. It's a ridiculous situation from the standpoint of the county being unwilling to balance these industrial uses against this, quote, historic, scenic, rural road. Think about the contradictions built into that. Next slide, please. Almost out of time here. This is mapping that we had done for the facility that shows the pathway through the wetlands of the facility, that once you dump that black muck onto the ground, it finds its way to the Patuxent River. I will say, maybe it's a little bit of bragging, the mapping's done by the same guy who did the mapping for the Bin Laden raid. He's a member of Patuxent Riverkeeper who works for the State Department, who does extraordinary mapping. We don't even know what satellites he uses, because I think if he tells us, he's got to kill us. So next slide, please. So this is where our office is. We are on in a natural resource area boundaried by county and state parkland. We run a visitor center. We rent boats. We run trips. It's kind of a clubhouse. That house in the center actually is literally our office. Basically a clubhouse for the entire watershed. We call it Patuxent River Center because in the river of the Patuxent, it is the center of the activism that exists on the river. This is the hot spot. Next slide, please. We're winding down. I can see I'm almost out of time here. We've done a lot of work in the last 20 years. We've done report cards, forward-looking studies, a fair amount of scholarly work. We have partnerships with numerous universities, colleges, science labs, and other facilities. The lawsuit, one of the 2 lawsuits we settled in the last week, sends $300,000 into our citizen water testing program. We're about to jumpstart the best water testing programs I think you'll find in the region. Again, there's no way we would have found grant money to do that work. But the idea, again, is to empower citizens with the equipment and the resources and the information they need to fight on their own behalf. And I think that's durable work. It's work that'll stick around after the grants are gone. It's work that'll stick around after the Riverkeeper is retired. It's work that should, you know, for those of you who are familiar with the Bay movement, Senator Bernie Fowler was kind of the best known advocate on our river. He died about 1.5 years ago at age 97. But one of his last words to me was, "Fred, keep the pilot light on." And that's exactly what we're doing on the Patuxent, because we know we're not likely to clean these rivers up in our lifetime as much as in the 1980s. This river came back to close to health within one political administration. So don't let anybody tell you this is like a 20-year journey, right? As much as we keep signing fresh 10-year agreements. The truth is, if you stop putting duty in these rivers, they get better pretty quick. And that's the deal. I'm not sure how many PhDs and how many studies we have to do to come to that obvious truth. You stop polluting them, they get better fast. Next slide. That's about it. We also run a summer camp, which is the 3-ring circus. Wears us all out. We're getting ready for the next season of it. Again, funded by reparations from various polluters. We run the camp on the basis of mentorship, and we've recruited a pretty interdisciplinary faculty of people from many walks. People of color, people from Native American disciplines. Kids learn how to read a compass in the woods, survival stuff. We have a special forces guy that will teach them how to dress a deer in the field if they want to do that. It's, like I said, kind of a 3-ring circus. But the point is that there's nothing doctrinal. This is not based on any school curriculum. It's based on giving kids outdoor mentors that can help them work on the stuff they want to work on, whether that's swimming, learning how to test water, any number of other things. Next slide, and I think that's probably the last one. I think I'm definitely out of time. Yeah, next slide. This kind of gives you kind of a cross-section of some of the stuff. We run the Patuxent Roughnecks. These guys actually maintain the Patuxent Water Trail. They clear snags, put up signs, build fire rings, and do other stuff. Basically modeled after Appalachian Trails trail workers, except these folks work on water trails. Very cohesive team of folks. Some of them, a couple of them got married to each other a few years ago. They have their own internal culture, the Roughnecks. Next slide. Hopefully that's the last one. Yeah, that's basic. Next slide. You can see it's very minimalist. We're not out there running chainsaws in the water and that kind of stuff. It's very solid teamwork, very minimalist in terms of disrupting habitat. But the idea is that keeps these waterways accessible, and within the Federal Clean Water Act, it makes them navigable, retains their navigable qualities for various other legal protections we can afford them. And so there it is. That's what Patuxent Riverkeeper is about. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and want to open it up to questions. Let me check in the chat. Let's see. Let's see if I can find a question here. All right, for Jennifer, what lab are you using for source tracking analysis?
I answered him in the chat.
Oh, you answered him in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm trying to find
That's
the
okay. We're just doing that in-house right now.
So this is for Ted. With different sources of federal funding becoming available for infrastructure upgrades, are you aware of any plan for Harrisburg to take advantage of that funding to address their outdated sewer system?
So there's some hurdles that Capital Region Water is facing when trying to get some of that money. There's some issues related to population size, to financial distress. They are eligible to receive very low interest loans, but they are having difficulties getting those grants from the infrastructure bill funding that's coming in through the state revolving loan funds, which Penvest controls and handles. So it's an area that we need to dive a little bit deeper into and understand exactly what those hurdles are. But that's what we understand right now is there's been difficulties from Capital Region Water acquiring any new funding that might have come in or will continue to come in for the next couple of years. So in addition to that, I will say that the City of Harrisburg is being charged stormwater fees. So residences, commercial businesses, nonprofits, churches, the state itself is being charged stormwater fees, and the state has refused to pay its stormwater fees, not just in Harrisburg, but statewide. So the City of Harrisburg is being charged on a monthly basis $30,000 and change, which equates to about $383,000 per year every year that Capital Region Water is missing out on because the state believes that stormwater fees are taxes and the state doesn't pay taxes, which is just a crock. And there's some challenges, I believe, that are going to be ahead of us pretty soon because there was a court case that came out of Westchester, which basically solidified that. So we have to wait and see what happens there. But more to come. There is a lot of deliverables that are going to be coming due in Harrisburg that we're going to be very, very keen on and have an interest in. So we'll have updates soon.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question of all of you on the panel. There's a lot of suing going on. So what pays for you to file lawsuits against these companies and such? Where does that money come from?
We use a lot of nonprofit law firms. I spent 3 years in law school, but did not take the bar. So I do a certain amount of self-help, but I find I can manage more litigation than I could actually participate in. I spent a clerkship for a year working for a state's attorney prosecuting drive-by shooters and homicides, which was completely depressing. In some respects, that's probably what sent me to Riverkeeper. In the end, that seemed like a much better deal than dealing with real bad characters. But yes, it is difficult. And I'll tell you one other thing. I don't think we're pugnacious. I think if you don't have lawyers in your back pocket, then you don't have the same quality of conversation with the polluters, right? If you go to them and say, pretty please, the cherry on top, will you stop doing what you're doing? And by the way, we wouldn't mind if you gave us a grant too. It's a pretty weak play. But if you go in there, I think trying to enforce these laws, and you're skillful and you're wily, and you have the stomach, I think, because the stakes are so different for these communities. We have to fight to win. We have to want it worse than the other side and have to do more work than they do. Because again, it's harder for us to mobilize those resources and the energy it takes to maintain these cases. It's really stressful work, to be honest. I've been sued personally in slap suits by developers. I've been punched in the nose by a housing developer on one occasion. I've been in a couple of bar fights on the Eastern Shore over big chicken stuff. So I do have some perspective on the fighting part, the struggle part. Let me put it that way. There's struggle involved with almost all of these games. Anybody else have a take on it?
I mean, I would just say, the Clean Water Act provides for it. Section 505 of the Clean Water Act allows citizens to file suits, citizen suits against polluters, which also allows, if successful, attorneys' fees, costs, experts' fees, costs, I believe, as well, to be recouped by that polluter. So many times if we are successful in negotiations and settlement agreements, a lot of times our attorneys will also negotiate their attorney's fees and costs with that polluter, so they are recouped those costs and fees. But similar, like Fred, we use quite a few different nonprofits that are litigating focused. So, for example, I love working with the Environmental Integrity Project. They're a really great nonprofit that is made up of ex-EPA enforcement attorneys. And those people had then quit the EPA because at that point in time that EPA wasn't doing their job, and some people like to call them the Environmental Polluting Agency. But anyway, that was a group that was formed by, that people that have the base knowledge of how a lot of this stuff works, and those are the kind of groups that we work with.
Great.
And I'm a board member, longtime board member of the Environmental Integrity Project. So he's right. That's a nonprofit law firm like Earth Justice, like several of the others, like CLA, Chesapeake Legal Alliance. There's several others.
So I'm going to pose one more question because we're coming towards the end of our time. This is from Linda Bergoski. She said, Fred mentioned working directly with communities of color directly affected by polluters. What about the other Riverkeepers? Does it matter to regulators and the courts that you are working with affected communities when recognizing and compensating damage done?
That is a big, deeper question. I think we have time to unpack.
That's a whole other webinar, huh?
But I'll give you a clue. I'm actually giving a TEDx talk on Earth Day in Foggy Bottom, and it's going to talk exactly about this. That's the
Great.
subject of my TED Talk. So look up TED Talks Foggy Bottom. You can buy a ticket or watch it later on YouTube. But that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about.
All right, well, thank you. In the last 2 minutes, I'm going to move ahead and we're going to close with a blessing of the boats that was written by Lucille Clifton. She was the first African-American Maryland Poet Laureate winner. Molly is our resident poetry enthusiast, so I was going to let her read this wonderful piece that she found for us to close out our evening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And thank you so much to everybody that we heard speaking tonight. It was fantastic to hear from all of you. So this is The Blessing of the Boats by Lucille Clifton. Okay. May the tide that is entering even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love you back. May you open your eyes to water waving forever. And may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that. All right. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Bonnie.
So that's a blessing for all of you Waterkeepers. Know that you're in our hearts and prayers and minds as you do your important work. You know, I know that I am so awed by the commitment and dedication. We've got tired Riverkeepers here, so we want them to be able to get up and go to work tomorrow morning and protect our waters. So we really thank you for spending your time with us to help us celebrate this Earth Day with IPC. We do have a quick survey we asked for you to take just to let us know how you like the program, what we could do better. If you have suggestions for other speakers that you would like us to have, we have an ongoing series of webinars every month to help educate our network of congregations. And so from all of us, we'll stay on a little bit, but like I said, we got tired Riverkeepers, so I don't want to keep them hanging out, but IPC staff is here to answer questions that you might have. And thank you and have a wonderful rest of your Earth Month.